Let me welcome you all here to the Divinity School. If you're coming from outside, those who are not, of course, you're welcome too. Today we're recalling a defining moment, I think, in Harvard's 20th century history. In the fall of 1938, and in response to the barbarity of the infamous Kristallnacht in Germany, where Jewish shops and homes were trashed, and more than that, a group of Harvard students with support from faculty and administrators rallied to bring student refugees from Nazi Germany to study here at Harvard. With time, this humanitarian initiative spread to 213 colleges and universities nationwide. And in the face of the horrifying magnitude of the Holocaust, saving and educating a handful of student refugees may seem now like a small thing over against the size of the Holocaust, but certainly it represents in its intent and action at least one of the high ideals of liberal, that is, freeing education. It is most appropriate, I think, that the Divinity School should sponsor tonight's lecture, given the fact that Divinity Schools here at Harvard played a leading role in the humanitarian effort of those days. In addition, the Divinity Dean at the time, Willard Sperry, was instrumental in this initiative and added his voice as well to the denunciation of National Socialist racism and pleaded generally for aid for the victims of Nazi oppression and hatred. May the example, I would like to hope, of all those at Harvard and elsewhere who stood up at the time to be counted encourage us to do our own part to the best of our abilities to address the dynamics of oppression and the barriers to free inquiry or to freedom altogether that are found all too amply in today's world as well, I'm afraid, some 7 decades later. But I should leave, of course, I think, all of this to our two leaders, particularly to the details of the story and the drawing of parallels to today's problems with injustice, totalitarian persecution, and the barriers to immigration that exist at the present time. Let me thus introduce you now to the two scholars who are going to speak to us tonight, scholars who are themselves colleagues and co-authors, co-workers together, and who know well the history of the refugee project we celebrate tonight, as well as much more about the many kinds of fugitives from Nazi oppression who found refuge in the United States and in Canada. Their joint lecture tonight is entitled, "What Happened to the Young Refugees Who Fled Nazi Persecution? Support, Success, and Sorrow," and it parallels their fascinating jointly authored book, "What Happened to the Children Who Fled Nazi Persecution?" And I commend that to you if you don't know it. I will introduce first our second speaker tonight in order to come to our first speaker immediately before his talk. Our second speaker will be Harvard's Mallinckrodt Professor Emeritus, Gerald Holton, now Research Professor of Physics and of History of Science, known to most, if not all of us here, I suspect, certainly as a longtime Harvard colleague, noted scholar, and public intellectual, the author of many books and articles, including Introduction to Concepts and Theories in Physical Science, Thematic Origins of Scientific Thought, Einstein, History and Other Passions, Science and Anti-Science, and Victory and Vexation in Science. Scholars of religion and psychology may have encountered him first, as I myself did some 4 decades ago, in his contributions to some of the famous Eranos Jahrbücher, based on interdisciplinary conferences on religion in Switzerland. He was founding editor of the quarterly journal Daedalus, and his membership in scholarly societies includes the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Institute of Religion in an Age of Science, headed by the astronomer Harlow Shapley. It's also my further pleasure to introduce now our first speaker, Gerhard Sonnert. He is a research associate at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics and an associate of the physics department here at Harvard. A sociologist by training, he has a particular interest in and multiple publications on the issue of gender in science, a very important topic at the present moment. And in particular, he's focused on the issues and obstacles for women in the sciences. His extensive book publications, several of them authored jointly with Gerald Holton, include Einstein and Culture, Gender Differences in Science Careers, Who Succeeds in Science, the Gender Dimension, and Ivory Bridges, Connecting Science and Society. So I'm pleased to ask Gerhard Sonnert to begin what is certain to be a very special evening for all of us. Gerhard?
Thank you very much, Dean Graham, for this kind introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to present this lecture. Our topic is what happened to the young refugees who fled Nazi persecution, support, success, and sorrow. And here's a picture of some of them as they arrived in New York Harbor. You can see the Statue of Liberty. And this is probably a very iconic image for America, the arrival in a new country, a liminal moment or a rite of passage. And I'm particularly fascinated by the boy to the left who doesn't care about it at all. He's very engrossed in his own private world at this moment where all the others salute the Statue of Liberty. Many youngsters, such as these, arrived in the United States from Central Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. Professor Holton and I devoted about 5 years to studying this cohort, and the project resulted in the book that Dean Graham also mentioned already. It's a book called What Happened to the Children Who Fled Nazi Persecution. What we want to do in this lecture is the following. We found in our study that there was a complex and varied web of support structures that helped those young refugees settle and actually succeed in the United States. In the first part, I will focus on one particular case study of local events that occurred at Harvard University in 1938 and 1939. And we also brought a few copies of an article in a Harvard magazine that Professor Holton and I wrote. So if you're interested, you can get one later after the lecture. In the second part, I will present some key results of highly successful careers that those young refugees had as a group. And then I will hand over the reins to Professor Holton, who is going to talk about the historical background that caused these young refugees to flee, and also about some lingering after effects. As Dean Graham mentioned, the Kristallnacht atrocities created an outrage on Harvard campus, and a protest meeting was scheduled for November 16, 1938 in Emerson D. This is a picture of the announcement, and you might not be able to read it, so in that case you just have to believe. But the first speaker mentioned on this is actually Dean Sperry. And so it's very fitting and appropriate that this lecture is at the Divinity School, and what is more, in the Sperry room, because Dean Sperry was involved in this really from the beginning. A plan was developed to bring students whose education had been interrupted and who in some cases were threatened in their lives to Harvard so that they continue their studies here. By the end of November, the Harvard administration agreed to bring up to 20 refugee scholars to Harvard, donating the tuition. And the students had to raise the living expenses for these scholars. And here's the headline of the Harvard Crimson, November 30. Corporation votes $10,000 in scholarships for 20 Nazi refugees regardless of creed. This made news not only in Cambridge, but nationwide. And the publicity was enormous, and it was almost like a wildfire. And within a few months, a national organization was created called the Intercollegiate Committee to Aid Student Refugees, led by the Harvard organizers. And in the end, more than 200 colleges nationwide supported refugee scholars from Central Europe, and several hundreds of those scholars were supported. That was an enormous feat of organization in a short period of time. In 1990, the Harvard refugee scholars returned to Harvard as an alumni festivity. And they did several things. A linden tree was planted in front of Boylston Hall. A plaque next to it in the ground reads, "To Harvard University students, faculty, staff, alumni, whose generosity 50 years ago opened doors to student refugees from Nazi persecution. May this tree express in grace and beauty the abiding and heartfelt gratitude of the recipients." And you could still see this in near Boylston Hall. The third thing the former refugee scholars did, was they donated money toward a lecture series called Dynamics of Oppression. And this is precisely why we are here at the second lecture of the lecture series. Sadly, oppression is very much alive and kicking around the world today. So there appears to be a continued need for a lecture series on the topic, and both Professor Holton and I hope that this lecture series will continue, and he will talk more about that. Many Harvard students then went on, after they had the scholarship at Harvard, to very distinguished careers, often in academia. The probably most prominent of those Harvard refugee scholars that many of you will know by name at least was Karl Deutsch, a very distinguished political scientist of the 20th century. The observation of great success in careers was also true for the larger group, as we found in our study. And now moving to the second part of the lecture. This is who we studied. Our study population were refugees from Germany or Austria, born between 1918 and 1935, who came to the United States in the 1930s and 1940s. And we determined that this was a total population size of about 28,000 individuals. We used several methods to study this, and I should say there has been a great deal of research on adult refugees from Central Europe, people who had already been in careers, and especially those who were famous. People think of Albert Einstein, Thomas Mann, Walter Gropius, Kurt Weill. There's a long list of names who were really famous. But before we embarked on this project, very little was known about the children, about young refugees who came from Central Europe, and in any systematic way. Now these people start writing their autobiographies, and there's more about this on a kind of individualistic level, but our purpose was to give a collective history using social science methodology of the whole group. And these are our methods. First, we analyzed large existing databases. Our best source was the United States Census, because there we could get a very representative picture of what these people did, what became of them. We also looked at the National Jewish Population Survey, and we looked at the Who is Who publication for the high achievers among them. The second method we used was we did our own survey, and we received about 2,500 responses. We looked for participants in any way we could, through refugee organizations, community contacts, compilations such as Who is Who. The famous ones are always easy to find, so that was not such a big problem. And the snowball method, which is asking people who already gave us a survey, if you have a relative who is also part of the group, please point them out to us, and we'll be happy to send them another copy of our survey. We also studied people who were similar to the refugees but who were not refugees. It's kind of a methodological thing. If you want to really know what's particular about students, you also have to get information about people who are not refugees. So, and the third method was interviews. We did 100 semi-structured interviews, each lasting between 1 and 2 hours on average around the country. We actually hired an interviewer for about 1.5, 2 years who traveled much through the country. Here is a very interesting result. When we looked at the Who is Who, we found 15 times as many refugees in the pages of the Who is Who than one might expect, given the relative size of these groups. So this was one general overrepresentation of the refugees, but we also looked at the fields or paths toward excellence that the refugees chose in comparison to the regular American population of about the same age. And we found that science and engineering were very likely paths to success for this particular cohort. From the census, we got some basic socioeconomic information. As you perhaps know, sociologists like to measure socioeconomic status in 3 dimensions: income, education, and occupation. That's what we did too. And so on each of these 3 dimensions, the refugees did spectacularly well. Income, about 185, almost twice as large as the comparison group. Education, almost half of the men had 4 or more years of higher education, which compares very favorably to 15% of the American-born people, men of the same age group. Interesting gender difference here. Only in quotation marks, 19% of the refugee women had that level of education, which is, of course, very much lower than the 48% for the men, but it is twice as high as for the American-born women. And if you look at it, it's actually higher than American-born men. So the refugee women outdid the American-born men in terms of education, if only by a little bit. So that's the glass full or glass empty, half full, half empty quandary. Third dimension was occupation, and that confirmed what we found in the Who is Who pages. That population was trending toward getting employment in the professions rather than in business and industry. Or in census categories, there were more professionals in that group of refugees and fewer managers. We repeated our whole series of analyses that we did with the census with the National Jewish Population Survey, because the Jewish group in America is known as a fairly highly achieving group. So in order for a control, we wondered, well, maybe the refugees are just very similar to American-born Jews, which would mean there's nothing particular about their fate as having been refugees to explain their achievements later on. So we had this different comparison group, American-born Jews of the same cohort, and the differences got smaller because the American-born Jews were more successful also than the average American population, but we could still measure the differences. So there was something about the refugees that set them apart even from the comparison group of American-born Jews. These are some sociological concepts we explored, the idea of assimilation. And our cohort is interesting because it's almost an extreme case of very rapid and thorough assimilation. There were many factors that caused this. One is immigration as such was at a low ebb in the 30s. There was a big depression going on, which reduced the welcoming of newcomers to the country because there was mass unemployment. There was anti-Semitism in the United States, and there were anti-German feelings, especially during the war. So for that group of immigrants, newly arrived children and youths, there were very strong incentives not to cling to a foreign identity, but to become Americans. And so this is kind of an extreme study of a research site where the goal of assimilation into the mainstream was really strong. And actually, contemporary sociologists in the 1940s assumed that the children would assimilate completely. But they were not completely right. And we used our study to show that there were limits to assimilation and that there were elements of distinctiveness, and we found several of them. I listed a few areas where our survey participants reported retention of European ways. We have a whole list of foods that they still like, cultural interests, tastes, preferences, values. So in many ways, even though the pressures toward assimilations were probably higher than in many other instances, it did not occur completely. There were some residuals. And now we also wondered how the former refugees would define their identity in terms of identity labels. If they pulled the ethnic option, as Mary Waters calls it, that you become some kind of a hyphenated American, Irish American, Jewish American, German American, or if you want to understand yourself as an American, pure and simple. And about half of our former refugees chose the label American straight up that we gave them. About a quarter chose a Jewish American, and the rest chose various other identities that we gave them to choose from. 9% of those chose a kind of a triple combination of an identity. Ingredients of success. That was another thing we looked at. Why did we get these results? Why were these people so enormously successful? On the one hand, there were general conditions. The depression subsided. Things got better as the 30s turned to the 40s. And after the war, there was a huge economic boom. So when you wanted to find a job in that situation as a young person, that was a good era to live in and to try to make a career, which of course applies to everybody, and it's not an explanation of an extraordinary success that our former refugees enjoyed. We coined a term called distinctiveness advantage, like how the differences that the refugees retained actually worked to their advantage. And that's, sociologically speaking, the mirror concept to what is often called segmented assimilation. In sociology, there's a big theory about segmented assimilation, that newly arrived immigrants would not assimilate into the American mainstream, but into the American underclass, where they would kind of live in ghettos and never get out of it. So they would, rather than becoming middle class or mainstream Americans, they would join the American underclass. That's called segmented assimilation. And we think we found exactly the opposite. It's also segmented assimilation, but on the top. And we feel that the differences that the young refugees retained actually helped them to succeed fabulously in the United States. And one concept we used, found very helpful, is the concept of cultural capital, coined by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And cultural capital can come in two main varieties. One is that cultural capital is one that these young immigrants had because they came from Central Europe, from Germany or Austria. So they all could speak German, for instance. And a lot of these people had successful careers as translators, as professors or teachers of German, as scholars who study European history or European politics. So that is making use of that kind of cultural capital that you get just because you grow up in this country and you know it. Other people became business people working for companies and took the European market, worked there. After the war, there was a lot of need for American military and officers to work in Germany, Central Europe, because of the Cold War, and so lots of our people also joined the military, could do well in Germany because they knew the language and they knew the people. So this is that type of cultural capital. that everybody has just because they were German, they know German, and so on. And I'm going to close the second part with this and then call Professor Holton. That's my hobby horse, so to speak, the cultural capital that is associated with social class. And this situation of refugees is an extremely interesting strategic research site to see how a status gets transmitted across a hiatus, and how cultural capital that is associated with a high social class leads to positive outcomes, even if there's a refugee situation in between, and seems to interrupt. I mean, I'm just trying to explain this a little bit in terms of what normally happens. In the United States, say upper middle class people tend to have successful children who also tend to be upper middle class children, and so on. And social class gets passed from one generation to the next, but we can't really be sure why that is. Could have several reasons. It could be cultural capital. It could be like the attitudes that get transmitted to the children, but it could be other capital. It could be money. It could be social capital. It could be that the parents just buy entry to the best prep schools, to the best private colleges. They pay for enrichment classes. They buy their kids all sorts of extra help and support them with their money. And then, of course, you don't really know why the children of the rich and well-off tend to have better chances in life and tend to become rich and well-off themselves, because it could have many reasons. In this situation, there was a kind of a clear-cut disentanglement. Many of the parents of our young refugees were very well-off in Central Europe. Some were not. But then all of them lost the material basis of their social class status, because they could be lucky to have escaped with their lives. So that was kind of an equalizing in the material area of capital. They all lost the money. They lost the family wealth. But why is it then that, as we found, the children of people who were in the upper middle class in Germany and Austria ended up more likely to be in the upper middle class in America than the kids who grew up not in an upper middle class home in Germany and Austria? Clearly, an economic explanation doesn't work here, because that had been equalized. So I was very, as a sociologist, I find that very fascinating, the power of social capital that gets transmitted from the parent generation to the children. And so the children do better. In this case, we know, not because the parents gave them a big inheritance and a silver spoon in their mouth, but because of something else. We call it the cultural capital. And that was a very interesting finding for me as a sociologist. But it's not all a very kind of rosy success story. And now in the second part, Professor Holton will impress upon you how even more unlikely it was, and how even a bigger feat it was for these children to do well, if you know the background of what happened, what caused them to come to this country in the first place. And also he will mention and talk about some lingering after effects at the psychological level that are not positive. I'm done now with my part, and Professor Holton will take on from here.
Thank you very much, Dean Graham. Thank you, Gerhard Sonnert. I'm very pleased to be in Dean Sperry's room. I knew Dean Sperry. He was an extraordinary person. No doubt. Without his name at the top of this list of speakers, there would not have been much of an action after that. He was a very inspiring man. And so
it is most appropriate that we are here in the second of the series, in his name, really. Now, the subject we are talking about, of course, is topical in many ways. There are now over 30 million displaced people, immigrants, refugees worldwide, some under the most wretched conditions. They suffer greatly under the dynamics of oppression, and they are worthy to be watched, and particularly by a school of divinity. So, and of course many of them are the victims of religious warfare. So it is that much more important that we are talking about this here. Now, you have been introduced very well to this second wave, the first being their predecessors to America in terms of coming already all established and taking distinguished positions and often changing the quality of American culture and economics and academia. What is behind my section of the talk is that there are two different trajectories. One of them is the trajectory of history, politics, sociology, ideology in general. And the other one is of the individual fates, which are very much up to luck and bad luck, which are up to being able to take advantage of a good opportunity or failing to do so. So the first trajectory, the one of history, which is behind all of the refugee story that we are talking about, is that one could start with the Gospel of St. John. I'm not going to do that here. But let us start at least with Hegel and his contemporaries, where the idea comes to particularly the German-speaking part of Europe, that the state is the overarching idea that will carry through, and it does not matter what kind of a statesman you have in charge or what general, that will all disappear in history. The important thing is that the state will survive. And that is imbued to the children too, from the beginning. And so very bad things can happen, and people in the elite, the generals and so on, the businessmen, will just wait it out and wait for better times to come, because the state has survived, and that is the important thing. So that's one thing that is in the minds of those who bend to away from seeing what horrible things are being done. Another point in history would be 1919. I'll skip 16. 1919. General Hindenburg, in charge of the now defeated German army, was called before Parliament and had to explain why, despite all the lives lost, all the money put into the war, why they lost. And he had a ready answer. It had been lost because the soldiers were stabbed in the back by three groups: communists, Jews, and women. Women because they saw their brothers or husbands fall and turned against the war. That stab in the back theory survived beautifully, particularly in the Nazi Party, then for a while still illegal, but gathering momentum. And in 1933, January, Hindenburg is in the position of appointing Hitler, who is not at all regarded at that time as the evil or even important person that he was. But he had a sudden renewal or enrichment of his persona thanks to what I might call his 9/11, which was February 33, just a month after he was put into office, when the Reichstag, the parliament, was suddenly on fire. And they found somebody who had done it, a communist, and now suddenly the country was up in arms against the evil forces that were trying to subvert the state, and he had his power from that moment on. So by April, his government dismisses the Jewish professionals, a repeat of things that happened before in history. England expelled its Jews. The Rhineland in the 11th century killed as many as possible before, as a kind of a homework before going on the Crusades, and so on and so on. We know this story. But so the dismissal of these people is a kind of a mild replay of the more ghastly things and the things to come. In early summer of that same year is the Concordat with the Vatican, which essentially makes the Vatican silent on all matters that have to do with the upcoming problems. And then between 1934 and 1938, in Austria, there arises its own kind of fascism under Dollfuss, though not regarded fascistic enough by the Germans, who in fact kill him, or have him killed rather. And from then on, history begins to really boil. And by 1938, on March 11, almost exactly 70 years ago, there is the march of the German troops into Austria. Leni Riefenstahl, who was no friend of the victims, in her autobiography described a typical event. Not one shot was fired, of course. On the contrary, as the troops came in, they were told, the drivers of the lorries, which were open, were told to put on goggles, because otherwise their eyes would be damaged by the flowers that were being thrown at the German troops that were coming in. That's in her autobiography. So she happened to be there in Innsbruck when it happened. Now, in the United States, there were also rather sad stories developing from the point of view that we are here presenting. Namely, there had been an outrage against immigration. 83% of Americans, when polled in 1939, said that they would not like to have any more immigrants come in. For the previous 2 decades or 3 decades, there had been quite a number, millions, 21 million immigrants. This suddenly was shut down to less than 500,000 a year, 500,000 a decade, for the next 2 decades. Particularly since Herbert Hoover asked a man called Breckinridge Long in the State Department to be in charge of making it very difficult to get a visum to come to the United States. At no point except 1 year was actually the quota fulfilled for people to come here. So that gives you a feeling what it was like to come. On the other hand, there were, of course, also some great humanitarians, like Varian Fry, you may have heard of. In England, Philip Noel Baker, the Quaker in the Parliament, who in November, after the outrage that Kristallnacht produced, asked the Parliament to allow 10,000 children to come to England. The Kindertransport has been much talked about in the last few years. And they came, of course, without parents. And that picture that you saw with a charming boy, you may have noticed that there were no adults there. About half the children that we have been studying in our cohort came without parents. And, of course, without money, and probably with a little English in many cases, and without friends, perhaps some foster parents waiting for them, perhaps in some lucky cases, a relative. That would be there. But there were others. There was, for example, Robert Lane at Harvard, a student, and Irving Landon at Harvard, another student. And it was they who dreamt up the idea that we must do something about these children abroad, and some of them already arriving, that need an education. And that is where the story that Dr. Sonnert told you at the beginning, where this Harvard effort paid off enormously nationally. So, of course, we are talking about the lucky ones. There were in Europe 1,600,000 children of the ages we are talking about, up to 17. Of those, only 100,000 survived the Holocaust. And of those, we studied the roughly 30,000, the survivors of the 30,000 that we could get hold of that came to the United States. So we are talking about a small group that was extraordinarily lucky through these turmoils of the trajectory of history to come to their own point. So some of them were helped by the fact that there was already this first wave here, and some of those were befriended by them. Remember that there were here at Harvard Paul Tillich as the first wave refugee of 1933, same year as Einstein and Thomas Mann had to leave Germany. There was Walter Gropius at Harvard. There was Hannah Arendt, often here as a speaker. There was Philipp Frank, the philosopher and scientist in the physics department and philosophy. There was Richard from Mises in the applied science department, all of them first waivers. And they, in many cases, took interest in the newcomers that helped them out. The second wave, these children that then grew up, born between 1918 and 35, had these successes you've just heard of, and just to give, again, the individual face to that trajectory, they included Henry Rosowski, for example, and Charles Fried of the law school, and Hannah Gray, who was on our corporation, and Herbert Kellman, and a number of others at Harvard. I'm just talking about those. In our group, we found, in our group alone, a couple of thousand that we looked at, there were 4 Nobelists in science alone. And these were just the survivors. Some of them had already died, and so they were not available for our study. Now, let me come to the end here with the sorrow part, the last item in our title. What was it like to be a child? Put yourself into the position of a child in Germany or Austria when these things are happening. To begin with, before the discontinuity in their lives, they are very loyal and loving patriots. They go marching and singing in their lederhosen or dirndl. They go to schools like everybody else, and if they go, as most of them I think did, to gymnasium, they would get a wonderful education in science and mathematics and all the fields, history, drama, because the idea of that education was that afterwards, if you want to go to a university, you could then choose any of these fields. You are ready to be a psychologist. Sigmund Freud, after taking the final exam in his being now about 17 years old, he writes to a friend, I passed the exam that gets me into the university. Pretty well. But best of all was Greek. They learn Latin, Greek, one foreign language, maybe French, and at home perhaps lessons in English or vice versa, and a bit of Hebrew. And he says, my best thing was Greek, because the question was asked about, tell me the story of King Oedipus. And I knew all about it and made no secret of it. He had already found what he's going to do to some degree. Well, the educational aspect of these children before the discontinuity was an element that one has to keep reminding, and it is an important one even for the people that are coming now. Many Asians, for example, Russians come with very good education, and they can take advantage of it as well. So they are ordinary children up to the point when suddenly in Austria on the 11th of March, everything changes. From one day to the next. They are suddenly unwanted. They're suddenly, their parents within weeks are told that they cannot open their shop any longer, or have to give up their practice as a physician or a lawyer, or have to hand over their business. There was one very ingenious thing done by this new government, most of which was Austrian Nazis, of course, and it was similar in the German part. Anybody could walk into a Jewish home, and Jewish is referred to not practicing Jews, but somebody who had one grandparent as a Jew and had been brought up as a Protestant, like Hannah Gray. But they were Jews by the Nuremberg laws. And they could walk in and say, leave this place, leave your flat now, get into the street, I'm taking it over. It's called Arisierung, to become Aryanized. And that could be done without fault to anybody, by anybody. To anybody who is Jewish, that is to say, by anybody who is not. And this discontinuity then reflected itself in the life of these children, of course, who had not been alerted, as their parents often were, that things are going badly. They found that this really changed them. And they saw their parents wilting. Even those that came to America with their parents very often found that America is not very friendly, and certainly not in those days, to the older generation. Particularly if they had been professionals, like lawyers, they couldn't practice. If they were physicians, they could not practice without examinations which were rigged, so that it would take 3 or 4 times before you would be allowed again to practice. And business people didn't have any cash or any authority with them. So very often the children saw their parents wilting, and they became instant adults, because it now was up to them to, in a sense, be having the dynasty on their back, so to speak. They already had learned it at home during the bad period, because in order to get out, you had to have a very large number of different papers, from the police, from the banks, from of course, the embassy. When you got into the embassy in Vienna, the American embassy, all the staff wore their swastikas. The Americans, of course, were behind doors and not visible. You dealt with people who were instructed to make it very difficult for you to get out. So, in addition, if you lined up outside, and the lines were very long, the danger was that the SS, which had arrived, by the way, days after the March 11th, in classes, the teachers themselves came, many of them in SA uniforms, and one of them in a class that I know about came in an SS uniform. They had already been illegals for a long time. Now, those lines outside the embassies, the American, the Chinese, other embassies, they were ripe for picking. So trucks would come up from the SS and load up people in them. At that point, it was very good to be very young, because then you could run. And so the people who wanted to get the visa and other papers like this very often had to rely on their children, 14, 15 years old, in order to get all those papers together, which is a way of getting an instant adulthood of a sort. So this continuity probably weeded out people who in the future couldn't make it so well. And so the group that we were studying had gone through all of that. And you can imagine that it was a kind of a education of a sort that you do not want to know about too much. The Kristallnacht has been mentioned. To live through that, November 9 to 10, the synagogues, practically all of them, were burned. In many cases, Jews were dragged out to help to destroy the shops and the synagogues. And then the Jewish population was asked to pay for the repairing of things, not of the synagogues, of course, but of other destruction. And if they got finally out with their visum, they would then have to pay what was called Reichsfluchtsteuer. That is a tax on having to leave. If there are any money left, that would be where it has to go and would be absorbed by the Reich itself. Well, obviously I'm coming to the sorrow part of our talk. A significant fraction, particularly during the interviews, even if they were extremely successful, told us that they are inwardly still having a deep psychological cost. And I was very pleased with the phrase which Dr. Sonnert helped to coin there, the privatized cost and the societal benefits. The privatized cost here, psychological, there's depression, nightmares, post-traumatic stress disorders, the report of suicides, inferiority feeling even by those who were most successful. They looked at themselves and wondered why it is that they had gotten where they are when so many others that they knew had perished. So I summarize my final thoughts here. One is that I hope the series will continue, not necessarily with this topic, but with one of the other many, many cases of the oppression that we all are witness to nowadays, all over the world. And secondly, that in our research, these young refugees, on the whole, did some alchemical reaction between their lives, very shaken up lives, and the opportunity structure that they found in America, including the aid organizations, of which there were many. Tocqueville would have been very proud of America to hear that there are 110 aid organizations available for immigrants that came in those days to take away the burden that they otherwise would find from the rest of the population. So they had succeeded against internal and external obstacles, and in the end, it's a story of cataclysmic discontinuity in their lives and in our history, of trauma, of resolve and adaptation, and of resilience, and of sorrow, and of amazingly good lives in America and for America. Thank you.
Professors Holton and Sonnert have agreed to take some questions, so we have a few minutes for that, and I would note that we will break off shortly because I think we're a small enough group that even if we go in to partake of the food and drink down the hall, that you can continue to speak with them and ask them questions. But perhaps there would be a couple of questions now first, please, and directed to either or both.
I wonder, Professor Holton, if your study will have a footnote to the informal aid agencies, particularly in Cambridge, the window shop,
Yes.
which Harry Levin years ago mentioned.
The window shop, I think there is even a book about it. It was founded by refugee, middle-aged and somewhat older women. Some of them very scary in their way of dealing with customers. They hadn't been used to being behind the counter, so they were very schoolmarkish about it, but very effective, very good food, and as you know, the profit from it was invested in Catholic students who had come as refugees. And this was one of those things which, you know, it would be difficult to think of it in many cases to arrive in a place like France and so on. But in America, they sprung up everywhere. So most synagogues had some kind of a help like this. Also, I should have said that among the refugees there were quite a few who were Protestants or very believing Catholics who could not stand the rise of liberalism and the fashion in general. And they too found this. And as a matter of fact, one of the, to me, rather remarkable things to know is that the Catholic bishops group that was helping their type of refugees was actually in some difficulty about money. And they got a good grant from a Jewish organization to help them go. So these help organizations were just magnificent. And then the other side of the American public that really didn't want to have much to do with it.
In your data analysis, were you able to stratify for those who did come either with parents or with family support versus those who did not, and did you find differences?
Yes. We expected that there should have been a difference because it's such a huge psychological effect, as Professor Holton mentioned, to be ripped away from your parents at a young age. And I guess going through these cycles of hoping and wishing that the parents would come out, because it was often unclear what happened to the parents till later on, till they found out that they actually had perished. And so we knew there was this huge trauma, and then we thought there must be some effect, but there wasn't. There was no socioeconomic effect, and it's again the supertanker thing. Social status is really a supertanker that is driven by sociological facts, probably not so much by psychological facts. So yes, we were able to stratify, and no, it didn't have a difference. Didn't make a difference in the outcome.
Speak up as loud as you can, unless you'd like to have a mic.
Small question. It was mentioned that of the refugees you studied, 4 won Nobel prizes, but then you said who were alive. And I was just wondering what would be the total of refugees who won Nobel prizes, including those that died before your study? Or
Did you have the question?
Yeah, how many Nobel prizes came out of the refugees?
Those who had died before the study.
Well, in our cohort, there are only 5, 4 of them in science, and 1 in so-called peace.
But you don't have any idea about others who had already died, but also...
Well, we know they're rare.
There were some.
But one can look up the list. But we didn't have access to them at all, and so we paid no attention to that part which didn't belong to our cohort.
I have a question, but also just a brief comment about the transmission of social class. And I can tell you that I know of at least one person, my father, who arrived with letters of introduction from his father. So the transmission happened even though there wasn't a lot of, money and so on at that point. But he had letters of introduction to a whole world that really immediately opened doors.
Very lucky.
The question is about those born between 1914 and 1918, because certainly in Vienna they were thrown out of the university, sometimes literally, and some of the people that I know who landed here at Harvard were born in those years as refugees. Is there a study about that group, or are you planning as well to look at the people who were in the university, really, at the time of the Anschluss?
Well, if I can answer this, sure. Not in our main study. That was really the cutoff was 1918 because we wanted to do a sociological study, not a historical study. So people really needed to be alive to fill out our questionnaires and be available for interviews. And we were afraid that we would be going back too much to people who are already too old. But in terms of the Harvard study, that was our one venture into the older cohort. So these people who came to Harvard University in 1938, 1939. These were people of the group that we talk about, and we thought we should include them in this case because it's such an interesting story.
In your study, when you did the surveys, did you happen to ask the refugees if they told their personal stories to their children, or was it the custom just
Yes, we asked them about this, and there was a lot of willingness or eagerness to share information with their own children, especially at the time that we caught them, when they were already elderly. And many of them did. Very few did not talk to their children. We also asked them, did you ever take your children on a trip to Germany or Austria to kind of show them where the family had come from? Many of them actually did this too, took their kids to their old places for closure. And the last piece of information that I remember that is pertinent is that more than a third had written their autobiography, and most are not published, or not even in the hope of publishing them as a book, although there are many books of that sort, but for the family, to preserve the record of what had happened in Germany, how their lives went, that the grandchildren and their children could have a record of their experiences. So that was a very frequent thing.
I should add that we didn't just, except now, mention that there was a questionnaire to be filled out, and it was an enormous questionnaire, many pages. Every detail about their children, their grandchildren, their fathers, their mothers, their grandparents, and further back, including, for example, their political interest, political affiliation. I remember that there were about only 3% that said, confessed to being a Republican.
Thank you. One more, if you could, please.
You mentioned that you had 2,500 responses, but did you send a questionnaire to everybody, all 38,000?
No. We didn't know. It was 28,000, and we got this number from the census. To get an idea of how big the group was, we could determine from census data how many came, but the census, of course, doesn't have names, or at least doesn't make them available, or addresses. So what we did is we looked for refugees through those various sources that I mentioned, like organizations of refugees. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has a list of, they call it Survivors Registry, that we used, and the snowball method. So we didn't send questionnaires to all of those.
Most of them had done it, actually.
No, well, we're still.
There were not 28,000 available.
Yeah, no, there were not that many questionnaires,
and it's also very difficult to find people, and particularly women who have changed their name by marriage. So that was quite an adventure to find people across the whole spectrum of ages and of different gender and also availability to actually respond.
What percentage did you get response?
Yeah, this is hard to say because we don't know. We worked under confidentiality principles, so. In rare cases, actually, when we contacted organizations like the Holocaust Memorial, they wouldn't share their address lists. They would just say, send us some questionnaire. We mail them out. We put our address label on them, and then you get the returns. So we know what the return was, but we didn't really control how many went out. So I can't give you a good number on that.
Well, let me thank you both again for just a stunning evening, and again invite everyone please to join us down in the Brown Room, which is as far as you can go this direction north in the building, where we'll have some food and drink, and I hope a chance for you to be able to ask things in a more intimate setting of both of our speakers. Thank you both again.